Welcome to the SALS video on the female reproductive system. After watching this video, learners will be able to describe the structure and function of each part of the female reproductive system, outline the process of oogenesis, identify the role of the hypothalamus, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone in the female reproductive system, identify the sources and functions of estrogen and progesterone, outline the phases of ovulation, and describe the menstrual cycle. So let's start with describe the structure and function of each part of the female reproductive system. This cross-section along the mid-sagittal plane of the female pelvic region gives us a medial view of the female reproductive system. To get our bearings here, here's the pubic bone on the anterior side of the female pelvic region. We have the urinary bladder as well as the urethra, part of the urinary system. We have the rectum and the anus, which are part of the digestive system. Between these areas, we have the female reproductive system, which includes the ovary, where eggs are produced and developed, the uterine tube, or the oviduct, that the egg travels down in order to get to the uterus. At the beginning of the uterine tube, we have the fimbriae, which guide the egg that has been released by the ovary into the uterine tube. We have the uterus, that as mentioned, the uterine tube connects to and conducts the egg down towards. In the bottom part of the uterus, we have the cervix, which connects the uterus to the vagina. Moving this image to the side, we can take a different view of the female reproductive system. This is the anterior view of the same organs that we were just looking at. Take a moment to get used to this view, as it's one that's often used in textbooks as well as other resources. As you can see, the same organs that we just mentioned are shown here: the two ovaries on either side of the uterus, the fimbriae that connect the ovaries to the uterine tubes on either side of the uterus that will conduct eggs down to the uterus, and then the vagina that is connected to the uterus via the cervix, which is not labeled in this image. Now let's outline the process of oogenesis, or egg creation. We'll simplify this picture and move it off to the side. And as you can see, there is a square here that has outlined the ovary so that we can take a closer look at that region. Here we have a zoom in of the ovary, and there's a few items to take note of. Prior to birth, a female has primary follicles that are the initial stages of all the eggs that she will eventually release as an adult. Primary follicles, following puberty, each month will be stimulated to develop into secondary follicles. As the follicles are stimulated to grow, they become a vesicular or Graafian follicle. As you can see, the follicle is made up of a number of different types of cells. In the middle, we have the oocyte. But all around it, we have supportive or nourishing cells that ultimately do not form the egg itself, but help to nourish the egg and allow it to develop. Here we have a microscopic image of the egg, the oocyte, within the vesicular follicle. As we continue, the secondary oocyte will actually be released from the vesicular follicle during ovulation. The secondary oocyte will then travel down the uterine tube towards the uterus. The nourishing cells that we were just mentioning will remain behind in the ovary and ultimately will form the corpus luteum. This broadly outlines the process of oogenesis, the production of the egg, the development of the follicles that contain the oocyte, the release through ovulation of the oocyte, and then the formation of the corpus luteum that remains behind from the nourishing cells that were once part of the follicle. However, how is all of this coordinated within the female's body? In order to look at that, we need to move on to identify the role of the hypothalamus, the follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone in the female reproductive system. Here we have an image of the brain, and within that image we have a square that is showing this portion of the brain. This portion of the brain is involved in helping to control what we were just looking at in terms of the ovary. It's made up of the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will release hormones, specifically gonadotropic releasing hormones, that will go from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then releases a number of hormones that will go down and stimulate the ovary. The first one is follicle-stimulating hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone comes down from the anterior pituitary, and it helps to, as the name implies, stimulate the follicle to develop from the primary follicle into the secondary follicle and then the vesicular follicle. In addition to follicle-stimulating hormone, the anterior pituitary also releases the luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone peaks just prior to ovulation and triggers the ovulation, the release of the oocyte from the ovary during the ovarian cycle. These two hormones ultimately come from the brain and help to coordinate these processes within the ovary, the development of the follicle and then the release of the oocyte during ovulation. Two other hormones also play a role in helping with the female ovarian and uterine cycles. Those two hormones are estrogen and progesterone. When the anterior pituitary releases the follicle-stimulating hormone and the follicle starts to develop, the cells that are within the follicle start to produce estrogen. Estrogen does a number of things. It plays a negative feedback role that goes back up to the pituitary and hypothalamus and causes FSH to stop being produced. This is a signal in order for the ovary to communicate with the hypothalamus and pituitary to let it know that an egg is being matured. The increase in estrogen also tells the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone ultimately then causes the ovulation, as we mentioned before. Following the ovulation, we mentioned the corpus luteum forms, and the corpus luteum is what releases the next hormone, progesterone. Progesterone goes back up to the hypothalamus and the pituitary, partly as a negative feedback system, telling those parts of the brain that an egg has been ovulated. In addition, progesterone goes to the uterus and tells it about what's going on with the egg in the ovary. We'll get to that in just a moment, but in order to help clarify these arrows, which may seem like they're going every which way in this image here, let's go through the cycle of all of these hormones that we've looked at so far. First, we have the release of the follicle-stimulating hormone that stimulates the follicle to develop. As it develops, estrogen is released, which ultimately tells the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone then goes back down to the ovary and causes ovulation and then creation of the corpus luteum, which releases progesterone. So let's outline the phases of ovulation and relate it to the hormone levels that we were just speaking about. Ovulation involves three processes. The first is the follicular phase. We just mentioned this. This is the phase where the follicle develops and then ultimately matures just prior to the second phase, ovulation. Ovulation occurs approximately halfway through the 28-day cycle. Following ovulation, we have the luteal phase, where the corpus luteum is formed and the corpus luteum releases progesterone. These three phases ultimately are called the ovarian cycle, as is indicated in the image here. If we move the ovarian cycle above, we can take a closer look at the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle shows us what is going on in terms of the uterus. Again, we're looking at a 28-day cycle, and it is composed of three parts. The first is menstruation, the second, the proliferative phase, and finally, the secretory phase, until we go back to the menstruation phase. Ultimately, this is a cycle, and so while it may seem odd that menstruation comes at the beginning of this cycle, it doesn't really matter so much where we start here because we will move from proliferative phase to secretory phase to menstruation, back again to proliferative phase, secretory phase, etc. through each monthly cycle of the female uterine cycle. If we take a look at the hormones that we've already looked at and how they play a role here, we can talk again about the follicle-stimulating hormone. We can see on the left side of the chart, the follicle-stimulating hormone is fairly high in concentration at the beginning of the ovarian cycle. While it starts to drop off to some extent, the follicle-stimulating hormone is high because it is the hormone that ultimately stimulates the follicle to develop during the follicular phase. As we mentioned previously, the follicle-stimulating hormone can be thought of as hormone number 1. Because the follicle is maturing, the nourishing cells within the follicle start to release estrogen. This increase in estrogen, as you can see here, starts the proliferative phase, the thickening of the endometrial lining within the uterus. This is hormone number 2 that we spoke about on the earlier image. As more and more estrogen is being produced, we can see that just prior to ovulation, there is a large increase in estrogen. This estrogen goes back up to the pituitary and ultimately causes the release of hormone number 3, the luteinizing hormone. As you can see, the luteinizing hormone spikes just prior to ovulation, so the pituitary is releasing that luteinizing hormone, which ultimately goes back down to the ovary and causes ovulation. When ovulation occurs, the corpus luteum is then formed from those nutrient cells that we talked about earlier. From the corpus luteum, we have the release of the final hormone, number 4, progesterone. Progesterone peaks, and this signal from the corpus luteum goes to the uterus and starts the secretory phase, where there's even more thickening of the endometrial lining. What's going on here is the corpus luteum is communicating with the uterus saying, get ready, get thicker, because the egg is on its way down the uterine tube. If the egg were to be fertilized, then we would have implantation down in the uterus in this endometrial lining. In the image we're looking at here, what happens as we move later and later in the luteal phase is we have the regressing corpus luteum. The luteum starts to die off and the cells release less and less progesterone. This is what would occur under the circumstances that the egg is not fertilized and does not implant within the endometrial lining. And as the progesterone levels decrease, we move into the menstruation phase of the uterine cycle. In the end, as mentioned earlier, it's a cycle, and so we start back at the beginning of both the ovarian and uterine cycle. Overall, there are a number of hormones and steps within all of these processes. However, a couple of the key strategies to keep in mind is that ultimately there is a cycle each month. In fact, there's an ovarian and uterine cycle. And how does the body communicate between all of these different organs such that we can produce an egg, release it, as well as prepare the uterus for an egg that is being released from another organ? In this case, hormones are key in order to communicate between all these different parts. Hopefully this video has given you a better understanding of the female reproductive system. Keep in touch with Sal's in a number of ways. Through Twitter, with our handle at DC_Sal's. Additionally, if you have any questions or want to contact us, please feel free to do so. You can reach us by phone at the phone number shown here, or by email at sals@durhamcollege.ca.